I was trying to remember the name of the Bhagavati and Hugh volume. Do you remember what it's called?
The Bhagavatian?
Hugh. I'm going to Google it.
Yeah, no. Well, you want to make a parallel?
No, I was just trying to. I think it's the best thing I read on these issues.
We're live on YouTube now.
Thanks, Anna.
Okay, you tell me when we should start, okay?
I think, Aaditya, you can go ahead and start.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Anna, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today and to welcome you all to this set of papers on non-trade issues in trade agreements. We have 3 papers on intellectual property rights, labor provisions, and environmental provisions. We'll begin with a paper by my dear friend and collaborator, Keith Maskus, with William Ridley, and it'll be presented by William Ridley. You have about 20 minutes, Bill, and we'll try and have 10 minutes for discussion. And so over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the host for putting this on. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. On a very dreary day in central Illinois. So are my slides coming through?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about some ongoing work that I've been doing with Keith, that we've made an effort to bring this very detailed World Bank data into on the trade impacts of intellectual property related preferential trade agreements. So a little bit of background on what motivates this work. It's that, first of all, even though today's session is on non-trade provisions, I think the literature has really coalesced around this idea that intellectual property rights are inherently trade related. And there's any number of stories you could tell about this, for why they might matter or why they do matter. But fundamentally, it's that, protections for knowledge assets, whether it's through patents, copyrights, trademarks, geographical indications, et cetera, govern the costs and benefits faced by rights holders, doing business internationally, whether that's, through trade, through investment, through R&D location decisions. And because of that, it's become a main policy objective of the US, increasingly the EU, members of EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, and more lately, countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, to encourage the development of stronger intellectual property rights regimes, particularly in developing and emerging economies. And the way they've been doing this has been increasingly under the auspices of preferential trade agreements. There's only so far that truly multilateral venues like the WTO can take these sorts of issues. So preferential trade agreements have kind of become the primary channel through which these policy changes are being effected. So the point of this work, and this is an extension of an existing working paper that I've got with Keith, but the point of this work is to assess the trade impacts of these IP-related preferential trade agreements, which I'm going to denote as IPAs throughout. Okay. So a little bit of historical background, and we're not only going to focus on the US, even though they've been historically one of the main drivers of these changes. But what has been the evolution of these IP-related preferential trade agreements? Well, your very first US trade agreement with Israel back in 1985 really paid only cursory attention to the issue of intellectual property rights. Very basic language, basically just, a non-national treatment. So, historically, there was very little attention paid to these issues because, well, trade agreements are about, market access. They're about reducing trade barriers, that sort of thing. But increasingly, and the U.S. was the main driver of this change. Increasingly, there's been these strong provisions related to intellectual property rights embedded in these trade agreements. This has been a big negotiating priority of the U.S. And you can see over time how the depth and breadth of these standards has evolved. But over time, the U.S. has really started pushing these elevated standards for its agreement partners, kind of as a condition that they want the partner to adopt in exchange for the expanded market access that these trade agreements bring. Okay, so there's this rundown here of what the U.S. has been pushing for over time. Increasingly rigorous standards that it's asking of its partners. And that's not to discount what the EU is doing in parallel to that. It's that the EU has increasingly started to focus on these IP issues. They're a bit later to the party than the US has been, but this has become a primary focus of the EU as well as EFTA in the trade agreements that they're negotiating. So a little bit on what the World Bank data shows us. So the World Bank essentially has this data has an indicator for whether agreements are number one, IP related, and number two, whether the language contained in those agreements is legally binding. So the main focus of the agreements that we're going to pay our attention to is these WTO-X IPR LE equals 2 PTAs, which essentially just means that the language is legally binding on IPRs. To the point where it essentially forces the agreement partners to adopt these standards rather than asks politely as earlier agreements did. So what you see here, and why I've been pushing this U.S. story so far, but EU and EFTA also matter here, is if you break down the coverage of these IP provisions. So there's provisions relating to treaty accession and ratification. For international IP treaties, specific areas of intellectual property rights like trademarks, GIs, patents, etc. What really stands out is if you look at the U.S. agreements, of which there are 13 classified as legally binding with respect to IP, the average number of provisions within these categories is uniformly higher than these other agreements. Whereas, in the EU and EFTA agreements, you see substantially less coverage of these provisions. But even so, the EU and EFTA agreements are more rigorous than the IP agreements of other major partners. And to some extent, these EU numbers are a little bit distorted by the fact that their earlier agreements were really less rigorous in what they asked of the partners. It's that the later agreements that the EU and EFTA have been negotiating do cover more of these aspects of IP. Okay. So this is kind of going to be one of our main motivations. And this is one of the driving motivations in our existing paper, is that we really are going to care deeply about these U.S. And European agreements, but we also want to pay attention to these other IP-related trade agreements that are increasingly coming into existence. So a few more numbers on what's out there, what's in the data. So over time, so your red line here shows the number of agreements over time, and the blue line shows the number of countries involved in one of these IP-related PTAs. But over time, you see this clear and upward trend. I said every year there's another one of these IP-related PTAs entering into force. And the U.S. was one of the earlier drivers of this, as I indicated at the start. The European agreements, EFTA and the EU, have increasingly expanded in number. But when you look at the other PTAs, so these are the IP-related PTAs negotiated by countries like Japan, like South Korea, like I suggested earlier. These countries are also increasingly emphasizing these elevated IP standards in the agreements that they negotiate. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to study the effects of membership in these IP-related preferential trade agreements, particularly those negotiated by these strong demander countries, like the US, like the EU and EFTA. And we also want to consider the role of these other IP-related PTAs, those negotiated by advanced economies such as Japan, South Korea, etc. And what we want to do is we want to disentangle the impacts of membership in these agreements on exports and imports, in particular on those sectors that rely most intensively on intellectual property. And we're going to imagine that these impacts might vary across levels of development. Okay, and I want to be very, very clear here what we're going to do. because our goal is to disentangle the generic effects of PTA accession, which includes any number of policies that must be adopted and tariffs that must be cut, because we want to disentangle those effects from the pure IP upgrading effects. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on exports and imports of these member countries with countries outside of the PTA. So countries, what I'll refer to as third countries. And this is an extension of the existing work I've got with Keith. And really our goal here is to, number one, see if we can corroborate our existing findings using the World Bank definition of IP-related trade agreements. And number two, see what we can say about the detail that this data affords us on these IP provisions. So, all right. What do we want to do? Like I said, we're going to assess the trade impacts, both exports and imports. In the paper, we consider both aggregate trade and bilateral trade, but for today, I'm just going to focus on the bilateral results of IP-related PTA membership. So data is fairly straightforward. We take commodity-level trade data, bilateral from BOSI, and what we do is we aggregate it up to these IP-intensive sectors, sectors that rely most intensively on intellectual property right protection, and I'll define those in a little bit, and a low IP control of relatively, non-IP intensive commodities like, simple manufacturers or primary commodities, that sort of thing. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a diff and diff gravity approach, allowing for differential effects of agreement membership along 3 dimensions. Number one is that, we're measuring across countries. Some countries join these sorts of trade agreements, and some countries don't. And we're going to, try to control for contemporaneous IP policy changes. Namely, we're going to control for the TRIPS compliance status of these countries, so that we're not erroneously attributing our findings to, just generic TRIPS compliance effects. So that's our first dimension that we're going to consider. And like I said earlier, number two, we're going to consider across sectors, whether agreement membership has trade impacts on IP-intensive versus non-IP-intensive trade. And number three, across levels of development. Do low-income countries versus high-income countries realize different effects? Okay. So a couple points that I need to make clear here is that we argue that we're identifying these pure IP effects because when a country accedes to these stronger IP provisions, MFN essentially means that they have to treat all countries equally, whether it's one of their fellow agreement members or a country outside the agreement. So we do believe we're picking up these pure third country effects. It's also the case, or it could be argued, that causality runs both ways. It's that maybe countries agree to these provisions for some endogenous reason. Well, number one, we argue that these provisions are typically included at the insistence of the major party, like the US or the EU. And number two, we're going to eliminate all trade with the major partner. So for example, if we're considering observations of Colombia-US trade with the Colombia-US PTA, we're going to eliminate all trade between Colombia and the US in the sample. So we're hopefully just picking up these pure third country impacts of these IP provisions. So here's what we're going to estimate. It's a lot to take in. So our main focus is going to be these IPA variables, which are indicators for whether country I or J, the exporter or the importer, is a member of one of these IP-related PTAs. So it's a 0-1. We haven't, addressed the idea that maybe multiple agreement membership could matter. But it's a fairly rigorous gravity specification with, these income group sector year fixed effects, country-specific time trends, and a bilateral fixed effect as well. And what we really care about here are these IPA variables. These indicators reflecting the treatment status or the effective treatment status for these agreement member countries on their trade with third countries. Okay, so like I indicated, we have heterogeneity along 2 dimensions, along income group, so low income, low middle, upper middle, and high, and these sectors, so the low IP control, I'll call it, as well as these high IP or IP intensive industry aggregations, so analytical instruments, biopharmaceuticals, chemicals, et cetera. Okay. And we're going to consider here 4 definitions of treatment. And it's probably not ideal to be seeking it, like to not know exactly what treatment is going to be necessarily, but we really want to be able to disentangle the effects of the U.S. agreements and the European agreements from, more broadly, what is the effect of, legally binding IP-related PTA in general versus the non-U.S. And European agreements. And then in case 4, we're going to consider what we call the beyond TRIPS, aka TRIPS plus provisions, whether the agreements with those provisions have some sort of expanded effect on trade. Okay. So case 1 is analogous to the results from a working paper, and case 2 is really what we're bringing in from this World Bank data. So case 1, the U.S. And European agreements is our first case because I made this argument earlier that these are the ones with the strongest IP provisions, again, owing to this being a priority of these countries. Okay. And, we could imagine that there are these generic effects across all of these IP intensive sectors. So, effects from, more expanded and vociferous enforcement of these provisions, countries acceding to IP treaties. But a lot of these provisions happen to be sector specific. From one of my earlier slides, we saw that a lot of the language in these agreements is on the pharmaceutical sector. So we might imagine that some of these impacts are going to be specific to certain sectors, pharmaceuticals in particular. Here's our first set of findings, and again, it's a lot to take in. These are the point estimates across all of these sectors and all these income groups. All of this estimated in this pooled gravity regression. And rather than breaking down, coefficient by coefficient, what's going on here, I'll just focus on the pharmaceutical results. So it's for the biopharmaceutical sector trade. And what you see is that there's largely this trade expanding effect with third countries of membership in these IP-related PTAs with the U.S. or Europe. So significantly positive effects for all of these income group classifications, which is what we would kind of expect to see and broadly conforms with our earlier results. And on the import side, again, there's a lot that we could focus on, and rather than just going through one by one, I'll highlight the pharmaceutical results. It's that we see these import expanding effects, particularly in pharmaceutical trade, of membership in these IP-related PTAs. So the takeaways, as we kind of expected, is that there's this strongly positive impact on pharmaceutical trade. Varies across income groups, but it's fairly consistent, and it's consistent with our earlier findings. Scattered findings for other sectors that largely move in the direction we would expect. It's that these stronger IP provisions that member countries are required to adopt expand trade in these sectors. Case number 2, we're going to consider all legally enforceable IP agreements, which includes both the U.S. and European agreements, as well as these other agreements that have increasingly come into existence, negotiated by countries like Japan, South Korea, et cetera, which are arguably less detailed and less in depth than the U.S. European agreements, but which still increasingly emphasize these IP provisions. So what do we see? Again, we could find scattered positive coefficients here, negative coefficients there, but again, I'll focus on the pharmaceutical results. Is that here we see more scattered evidence, strongly negative impacts for these low-income countries. That's the point estimate for the low-income countries down there, but kind of monotonically increasing with level of development. What might be the reason for that is a question we could ask. So that's the export side. On the import side, again, we see ICT imports, strongly positive effect for low-income countries, a few scattered effects for high-income countries. But again, for pharmaceuticals, we see this monotonic effect. It contrasts with our earlier findings because, well, previously we found both larger effects and more consistently positive effects of membership in IP-related PTAs. So a bit more scattered, and it seems to be the case that it's the US and European agreements that are driving these trade impacts. And we can confirm that by considering these non-US and EU and EFTA agreements and focusing on the ones negotiated by Japan, by Korea, and a few others. So if we do that, Findings are even more scattered. I suppose you'll just have to take my word for that. But the pharmaceutical results have largely, evaporated. We see some negative coefficients on pharmaceutical exports to third countries for membership in these non-U.S. and European agreements. We still get this strongly positive ICT import effect, a few others here and there. And on the import side, really the pharmaceutical findings that we found such strong evidence for earlier have gone away. So it seems to be that it really is membership in these U.S. and European agreements that's driving a lot of these results. And that's intuitive because, well, from the get-go, I've tried to convince you guys that, the U.S. and European agreements are the ones with the strongest, and most in-depth provisions in this regard. So as a final case that we look into because, of its relevance in the policy environment, a lot of controversy over the IP provisions in these agreements has originated from these provisions. So as a final exercise, we want to consider what we're going to call the beyond TRIPS, which are really known more commonly as TRIPS plus provisions, but to avoid confusion on language, because the World Bank database has a separate set of TRIPS plus definitions. We're going to consider a core set of beyond TRIPS provisions. Particularly, we're going to look at the agreements that possess at least 3 out of 9 of those provisions and consider that as a final treatment definition. Okay, and if we do that, when again, there's a lot to take in, but focusing on the pharmaceutical trade, really nothing jumps out, which kind of contrasts with what we expected, because these beyond TRIPS agreements, these TRIPS plus agreements, are really the ones that emphasize pharmaceutical protections most strongly, whether it's with test data confidentiality provisions, linkage rules on generic competition, that sort of thing. We really expected to see more going on here. We find similar results on the import side. It's that these IP-related agreements with these TRIPS plus provisions really don't evince much in the way of consistent export or import effects, in contrast with our earlier findings on the US and European agreements. So not much that we're able to find here, but admittedly our treatment definition is a little ad hoc because our cutoff here was, does this agreement possess at least 3 out of 9 of these core TRIPS plus provisions relating to patentability and patent rights and test data rules for pharmaceuticals. So the treatment here is fairly ad hoc, and that might be what's driving our lack of findings. If we instead focus solely on the agreements with test data confidentiality provisions, that seems to actually generate significant findings on the pharmaceutical side. But that's still to be explored. So to wrap up, so we extend our existing work looking at the IP, the impact of these IP provisions embedded in these free trade agreements, these preferential trade agreements, asking whether adoption of these provisions by member countries drives some sort of trade expanding effect with third countries outside of the preferential trade agreement. So we take a lot of steps to account for potential endogeneity and make sure we're capturing what we want to capture. In general, we find modest trade effects. It's that most sectors and most income groups are not impacted. But having said that, we do find fairly consistent evidence for some of these most IP-reliant sectors like pharmaceuticals, mixed results on chemicals, consistent results on ICT trade. We do find consistent effects in certain sectors, as we would expect, given the specificity of the provisions in these agreements. So there's a few things we could add on, but it seems to be the case that these IP chapters are driving some change in trade, an expansionary effect on trade, and I think that's the main takeaway from what we've been able to do here. So that's all I have.
Very much, Bill, for saying interesting, important things in time. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Please feel free to jump in directly. I haven't received any YouTube questions, but if there are, Anna, you tell me.
I don't know. Aaditya, am I unmuted?
No, Keith, please go ahead.
I do think that this approach of deciding, how to identify these things through designating the more specific into these provisions you go, the more ad hoc it gets to decide how to actually do these things. So I'm not too surprised that the results at that level aren't showing up very much. But it does appear that that these really sort of strong expectations in these kind of EU and US agreements does have some substantial impact, especially in the biopharmaceuticals area, which is in a sense not too surprising because that's where all of the sort of political action goes on in this area. But that's I think an interesting takeaway. We're going to continue with this and see if we can sort of find a better way to go about identifying the particular provisions.
So I see a question. It looks like we're looking at short-term effects, and have we considered longer-term impacts? So we also ran a version of our analysis with 5-year lags, kind of to account for potential phase-in effects where the effects aren't realized immediately. And with that sort of approach, we broadly find the same sort of impacts. If that gets at your question.
Thanks, Bill. Ingo has a question about investment relations, to which I'll add a footnote because he'll probably say more interesting things than I was going to say. Ingo? Ingo, are you muted? I can't. Ingo, unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry about that. I was muted. I'd like to pick up on the fact that for the US agreements, you find action on the low-income country side, whereas for the EU agreements, you find action on the high-income country side. Now, some of these industries like pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and so on are known as value chain industries where there's a lot of back and forth trade. Could you somehow try and unpick that finding with provisions on investment relations and perhaps even just an empirical proxy for bilateral investment flows? It could be that the EU has consists of several different advanced markets, and so investment is more between high-income economies, whereas the US has a lot more investment, outgoing investment into low and middle-income countries. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so
Bill, before you respond, just a quick question. I haven't followed this literature, but in terms of understanding the why, the conceptual framework where you have both trade and investment, I just wanted to understand, you're looking at trade with third countries. Is it implicit that stronger agreements attract investment and therefore encourage trade? Or are you thinking of more direct links between? So I'm trying to and understand what kind of conceptual framework would rationalize or motivate your analysis.
Yeah, and you both raised very good points that Keith and I have thought about. It's that clearly there's some sort of investment story going along in parallel to what we're finding. And it could even be that that's what's driving the results. It's that, maybe this is, MNEs doing some sort of offshoring and exporting. We really can't say. So I think the best I can say is that for now we're agnostic about it. We do believe that investment in some form is underlying these results or operating in parallel with these results. But given the approach we have, there's really nothing definitive that we can say, even though it clearly is an important part of the story.
Thank you, Tristan.
Yes, I had a question, I guess, about mechanisms. And so, one of the things that could be going on here is just that there are heterogeneous effects of the agreements. And the place where you'd see the largest effect on trade would be in the countries where before the agreement, there was a lot of domestic industry which was able to compete with things that didn't have IP protection. So I'm thinking of a country that had a large generic pharmaceutical industry and it had to perhaps shut that down a little bit and then substitute to the imported good once the imported good was protected. Perhaps you could look at heterogeneity in terms of the size of the domestic industry. I'm thinking just like, sales of pharmaceutical firms on the local stock exchange as a share of GDP or market cap or something like that. It would just give you a sense of how large the domestic industries are.
You raise a fair point. That's certainly true. I think the best I could say is in our empiric specification, we're trying to account for these underlying features of these domestic markets, probably imperfectly, but I do like your idea of accounting explicitly for the features of these markets before they enter these agreements.
I'm not saying like control for it. I'm saying like if you can sort of split the sample into places.
Yeah, I got you. But no, it's a good idea. We'd like to do something in that direction. So.
The question? Okay, Bill, thank you very much. I think your paper raises a very interesting question of how much ex ante structure we give to these exercises, and also, this database that we have created is really richly textured. At one extreme, it is a pure, agnostic machine learning approach. At the other extreme, you have a stronger analytical framework. I think it'd be very interesting to see you take this work forward, and pleasure to watch this develop further.
Yeah, it's fantastically detailed data, and there's a lot we could do. So we're still thinking about ways to move it forward. But thanks everybody. Thanks for your comments.
Okay, we move on to our next paper on labor provisions, trade agreements, and trade flows. Ray Robertson of Texas A&M University. Ray, over to you, 20 minutes.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this work with you. I'd like to especially thank the organizers, Anna, Michele, and Aaditya, for inviting me and obviously putting together this amazing data set. I'd like to share with you a little bit about deep integration and trade agreements. We're talking about labor provisions, tariffs, and trade flows. The title is slightly different because we added in a couple of other dimensions, but I thought you might find some of this interesting. Just to give you an overview of the literature, there's been a lot of debate about labor standards and trade. So the inclusion of labor standards in trade agreements has been very controversial. And I'd like to acknowledge one of my co-authors on another paper, which is Desiree Leclerc, who's a lawyer at Cornell, who emphasizes this difference between intent and impact. So there was a lot of debate about the intent over the labor provisions. For example, there was three main basically ideas as to why we would be including labor provisions in trade agreements. To stop the race to the bottom or to help partner workers. So the idea here is that trade is somehow exploiting workers in developing countries, taking advantage of poor working conditions. And so the idea of including labor provisions would be to help those workers specifically and try and raise the conditions in which they're working. Another option is to harmonize standards or lower trade costs. And there's a number of people who contributed in this area. You can see those on the right. Sandra Pulaski's advocated for this. But the idea there is just to use trade agreements as a way to harmonize standards around the world, as a way of lifting up workers, but also to make it easier for multinational firms. We just heard a little bit about in one of the questions about the global value chains, right? Global value chains operating in different countries, harmonizing standards lowers trade costs and facilitates trade. And then another one, and it's Keith Maskus, who's on the call with us and just was a co-author in the last paper, about this argument that basically they are protectionism in disguise, right? So the idea here is that we would like to include labor provisions in, say, US trade agreements as a way to help domestic workers, to help US workers from what might be considered unfair competition from other countries. Other countries don't enforce their trade laws, or they don't enforce their labor laws. They don't enforce, they might have a minimum wage or not, they might not enforce it. So that puts our workers at a competitive disadvantage. And so in order to counterbalance the unfair trade practices, essentially that drive down foreign labor costs, we would include labor provisions. So there's another part to this literature that really focuses on the impact, and you can think of two different areas in which these labor provisions might actually have an impact. One is focused on, do they do what they're intended to do, right? So do they affect labor market outcomes? For example, in that first example above, do they change labor market outcomes for workers in developing countries? So there's a number of important papers. I'd like to also acknowledge Daniel Saman, who's another one of my co-authors, who's done really interesting work in this area, as well as Kamada. And then the ILO's 2016 overview pooled a bunch of different elements, but they also focused on whether or not these labor standards actually change labor market outcomes in developing countries. The other part of this is changes in trade flows. So that is the part I'm going to be focusing on today, is looking at whether or not including these labor provisions in trade agreements changes trade flows. And that would help inform maybe some of the debate about the intent perhaps, but also it's really critical for our understanding of trade agreements. And a lot of what we're doing, is made possible through this handbook on deep trade agreements. So I'd like to acknowledge the important contribution made by the handbook. When you look at the debate over labor provisions and trade flows, there's actually a very large literature on estimating, trade flows and trade agreements. So Jeff Bergstrand's online. I'd like to thank him for all the amazing work that he's done. We obviously cite you. So thank you very much. But there is a very large literature about this. There's basically a bunch of papers that focus on the policy implications. There's been a number of advancements on the last year or so on technique. So we're trying to keep up with that. And another part of this is the various classifications of labor provisions, right? So Kamada and others find very limited effects by using very rough measures or categorizations of these labor provisions. And I'm going to get into these labor categories later. Another really important paper is Carrere et al. I'm probably not saying that correctly, but 2017, which is a really great paper that differentiates enforcement levels and finds generally positive effects of the labor provisions. So there's generally a positive correlation between having labor provisions and trade levels. And then I had another paper, which we finished up this year earlier on with, like I said, Desiree Leclerc and Daniel Saman. Desiree Leclerc's a lawyer, and she helped devise a legal-based classification. And we use that legal-based classification to estimate the changes in trade flows based on the labor provisions or not. And then we find generally positive effects there. So there is some very recent work being done on this. But some of the main problems coming out of this literature that we would like to address. Number one is, the full set of controls that we just saw in the last paper, the full set of these dummy variables and, for example, country-specific time trends and the pair-specific effects. Those are rarely included. So we're using some of the new techniques. We're doing a PPML in this paper to address that. So we're including all of those. And then secondly, and this is really a key issue, and I think this applies to a lot of the papers broadly in this area, not just labor provisions, but maybe a lot of others, is to really acknowledge the fact that labor provisions are part of these larger agreements. And that really helps emphasize the importance of the handbook on deep trade agreements, right? Because you really need to take into account that there are many provisions in trade agreements. All of them might be affecting trade, as we just saw, for example, with the intellectual property rights is having an effect on trade. There's lots of other things having an effect on trade. So it's possible that any effect that you find, for example, on labor provisions might be driven by changes in other parts of the agreement. So we want to try and control for that, which I said before was being made possible by the handbook, which is really important. Okay, so, just like all these other deep agreements, labor provisions have been rising dramatically. So if you look at the total number of agreements here, and then you see the total share with labor provisions, they've been rising, kind of stuck with them. So it's increasingly important. All of the US agreements, for example, have trade labor provisions, at least the ones since NAFTA 1.0. So that's really a significant issue in trade. So our empirical approach here is we're going to be using just the same kind of gravity model in the last presentation. We're using bilateral trade data from Comtrade. We cover 1990 to 2018. We are doing annual data, not the 5-year intervals, but so that gives us almost 1 million observations, possible observations, including lots of zeros. Then we add in the world development indicators for GDP and others. And then we also merged in the CPI gravity data set for country and pair characteristics, which obviously fall out when we include the PPML with exporter year, pair exporter and importer time trends. We do cluster the errors by country pair. But just for robustness, and there's a whole second part, like an annex to the paper, which I'm not going to discuss, but we run all the same exercises by including the zeros and using a zero inflated Poisson and the PPML with the country characteristics. But basically the results are the same, surprisingly. So just if you're interested in the models or including these country effects more explicitly, these country characteristics, that's also in the paper, but I'm not going to talk about any of that today. I'm just going to focus on these PPML difference and difference with all the fixed effects and time trends. So what are these labor provisions? So I've been talking about labor provisions, maybe almost 10 minutes, and I haven't defined them. It turns out that the idea of labor provisions are varied. So there's 5 main categories within the handbook on deep trade agreements. So one group has sort of aspirational labor goals, like the countries sign the agreement, they aspire to improving workers or addressing worker concerns or whatever. Then there's substance-related labor provisions, and I will talk about these in more detail, but these include, they draw heavily from the International Labor Organization's, international labor standards. They're basically setting the international labor standards through the accords that they've set up. And there's 11 subcategories in that area. There's substance-related labor provisions that are tied specifically to investment that only has one subcategory. There's also provisions for cooperation over labor provisions. They just aspire to increase cooperation. And then there's institutions overseeing labor commitments. And this last part, which is category 5, is the one that has a lot of the enforcement aspects. So, if you're an economist and you think about, what are the ways that labor provisions would be affecting trade, one way you might think about them is that they increase labor costs, or they increase production costs, therefore, and that would reduce trade. But obviously that's not going to happen if necessarily if there's no enforcement of the provisions, right? If there's no agreement to actually enforce domestic labor law, to enforce minimum wages, to enforce other kinds of working conditions. A priori, you would think, or at least I thought, I don't know what you would think, but I thought at least that these institutions and the enforcement might be particularly important in estimating the effects of trade. So there's also concerns about endogeneity, and I definitely wanted to acknowledge, Reyes Ansari's 2018 point where they show that the presence of these labor provisions is not, uncorrelated with domestic labor strength. So domestic labor unions and the presence of labor organizing in a country is associated with more likely to have these provisions. And then there's this other obviously important paper that I mentioned earlier, the Carrera et al. Paper on North-South trade flows matter, right? You might think that these provisions matter. So just to give you an idea of how these provisions differ. So if you look at, this is just the conditional correlation between GDP differences and labor provisions. So this is the absolute difference in GDP per capita across countries and whether or not there's labor provisions are more likely or less likely to appear. And if you see here, this 5, 6, 7, 8, which are listed over here, so there's specific descriptions of these, whether there's agreement include reference to fundamental rights and work, this comes out of the International Labor Organization, or whether or not the agreement includes reference to protecting, promoting freedom of association, collective bargaining, and then forced labor, and then child labor. It turns out that 6, 7, and 8 are perfectly correlated. That's why they're showing up as zeros here, but they really should be up here just because this perfect correlation suggests that they're highly likely to be present in countries with the largest GDP differences. So they're more likely to appear in areas, in agreements between countries with the largest GDP differences. If you look over here, there's a couple that are sort of negative. This 12 and then 23, which is whether or not there's reference 12 to internationally recognized labor standards. And then does the agreement require states to prepare a labor impact assessment? So this is this is that last part of potential enforcement. And that's actually, these are more likely to be found among countries with similar GDP per capita, right? So this is actually something that similar countries are more likely to have. So that might speak to this idea of harmonization more than the protection argument. But a lot of this is just kind of motivating this argument. Number 10, of course, is another one I probably should just mention, whether or not the agreement includes a reference to protection of promoting working conditions in terms of employment. I've done a lot of work on working conditions using data from the ILO's Better Work program. And so that also factors in as well. But anyway, so there is potential, endogeneity in this, but it doesn't seem, these are results actually, to me, seem a lot less striking than I was expecting, right? If you have, I expected to see a lot more of these between the larger different countries, and you don't really. So it's not a lot of support for this kind of protectionism argument. So then if you look at the unconditional correlation coefficients between these main categories, the aspirational labor, aspirational goals and objectives are actually not very highly correlated or negatively correlated with a lot of the other provisions, but obviously the substance related, especially the number 2 and number 3 in terms of investment, are highly correlated. So you might think that this might not need to be a separate category. I don't know. And then, they're also highly correlated with cooperation in institutions. So this is kind of where the meat would be. Obviously, investments, not surprising, would be highly correlated, but they're very different from these aspirational goals and objectives. But these are just, the unconditional correlation coefficients. This is not really, very rigorous. So we want to just present these baseline results. So these baseline results, again, are the PPML estimates. They're basically going to be dropping a lot of those zero values. So we're down to about 500,000 observations. But as I said before, we're including all these fixed effects. The trade agreement dummy is generally not significant. So Jeff or others, I don't know if you guys have some insight on that. But when I do the separate PPML and ZIP regressions, it does show up positive and significant. But the main point, and this is kind of the main message of the paper, is that these labor provisions, especially in the aggregate, are positive and significant. So they're positively associated with trade. If you separate out these international labor standards and separate subcommittee categories, they're the only significant estimates, right? But cooperation does turn negative and significant. So that's kind of interesting. But generally, overall, the effects are positive. So that's our baseline result. If you look at the next thing, though, is whether or not tariffs, right, really matter, right? Because it might be that the tariffs are correlated in some way with the presence of these labor provisions. So if you reduce tariffs more in an agreement that has labor provisions, obviously you'd find a positive result of the presence of labor provisions, right? So we wanted to take advantage of the richness of the HDTA and include tariff measures. So we're going to add tariff preference margins. The higher margins obviously mean lower relative tariffs. So the higher margins should be associated with more trade, ceteris paribus. But, the detailed correlations are in the paper. I didn't want to give those to you now, but they're generally negatively correlated with labor provisions. So the largest correlation coefficients are in machinery, electric, plastics, and wood products. So the labor provisions are more likely to be associated with smaller margins, which would be more consistent, again, with this protectionist idea, not that they're counterbalancing. And when you look at these estimation results, the tariff preference margins are positively associated with trade flows, as you would expect, but the aggregate labor provisions are still positive and significant, generally down the line, with maybe this exception of cooperation. So you basically get very similar qualitative results that are, we would argue, not being driven by the presence of tariffs. So then there's a bunch of other robustness exercises. We aggregate the main categories 2 through 5 because they're highly correlated. But generally, you still get positive and significant results. When we look at trade between countries that are like more frequent traders, you get basically the same results. And then when you look at the direction of trade based on GDP per capita, you get the same results when high-income countries export to lower-income countries. But when you do the reverse, when lower-income countries are exporting to higher income, the only significant results are in institutions, and they're large and negative. So you do see here that there is a negative effect based on the imports from the poorer countries for the richer countries. So that's consistent, as I said, with this other paper. So that's, I think, really interesting. But then another concern was on the robustness is that there's a paper, if you were in the first session of this seminar series, you saw the paper that Tom Zilkin presented, Breinlich et al., which identified, they used a machine learning lasso technique to identify the non-labor provisions that affect trade flows. and they identify, a number that are significantly associated with trade flows. So they found anti-dumping, competition policy, 1 in subsidies, and 4 in technical barriers. So what I did was I worked with Tom a little bit, and I got those measures, and I included them. I found that they're weakly correlated with the tariff margins, and the correlation between these provisions and labor provisions are mixed, but generally positively associated with these different ones. So when you add those into the regression results, again, with the PPML with all of the fixed effects, the coefficient of the other significant provisions are stable across provision specifications. There's no obvious multiclinearity, but the labor provision results don't change, right? So they're not being driven by this other effect. They're generally positive, except that cooperation, which is negative, but overall they're positive. And when you're comparing the income differences in terms of the direction of trade, the same results emerge for the higher income countries' exports to lower income countries. But when you compare the income differences in the other way, including these other provisions that Tom and others, his co-authors, found, is that the negative results disappear. And so the only remaining result is this positive effect, which leads us to conclude again that overall the effect seems to be positive, even when you consider income differences. So overall, the relationship between labor provision and trade flows seems to be very positive, which frankly is not what I was expecting. The positive relationship is very robust, including tariffs and other key agreement provisions. And the only negative result comes from the lower income countries exporting the higher income countries. But like I said, that goes away once you include these other provisions. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ray. Questions?
I could have talked much longer.
Let me ask you a question, Ray. Sorry.
This is Keith. I was going to ask something, if that's all right.
Okay, I'll finish. I was just going to say, so there is the cost dimension, and there is, the positive dimension. At least one way of seeing that is consumers or investors being sensitive and being willing to produce in locations which have higher standards. My question is, are consumers, do they pay attention to labor standards and agreements, or how does that information communicate itself to consumers in a way that investors might care?
So that's a great question, and I've done a huge amount of work in this area, so I don't want to bore you with a great detail, but it turns out that companies, especially the ones with a recognizable name brand, so if you think of Gap or Levi's or Nike, the companies that you would recognize, they believe that consumers care a lot, and they care a lot about what maybe not so much what consumer groups think, but what other activist NGOs think who are claiming to represent consumers. And they actually respond a lot. So in that sense, having countries that have higher labor standards has been attractive to investment. And there's been a number of really important papers that have shown that investors prefer areas with higher standards rather than lower standards. So whether or not consumers per se care, I know that the companies really care about what they perceive consumers think as filtered through these NGOs. So that might be a positive a reason for this. The other thing is there's also been work in political science, that there's been another recent paper that shows at the firm level that firms reward higher compliance with greater orders. So that's at the firm level. So I'm actually working, I did a gravity model paper, which is separate than this, that looks at like the presence of better work program, which is a program by the ILO to increase labor compliance. And that's positively associated with trade. So they seem to reward higher companies seem to reward higher compliance with more orders. Does that answer your question?
Hi, Ray. I think we might have lost Aaditya.
Do you want to go to Keith?
Let's go to Keith for his question, and probably Aaditya will reconnect soon. Keith?
Keith, you're
You mentioned
muted.
that.
There you go.
Thank you, Raymond. You mentioned that piece I did for the World Bank back in 1997. It was trying to show that it really depends, right? These things can go in any way, and part of the story that labor standards could be sort of efficiency enhancing has to do with efficiency wages and structural issues like that. Do you think you can sort of support that your results would support that kind of a story, or is it just too hard to make that case?
So I think it's very difficult without the firm level data to show that. I think there's a rising consensus out of the community of people who are focusing on this. And what they conclude is that there is an efficiency wage effect. I think you're right about that. And they show that that it improves wages, improving working conditions at their factory level in developing countries increases wages, and it increases, obviously, worker satisfaction. And it does increase efficiency, so there is an efficiency wage story, but it doesn't increase efficiency enough to compensate for the higher profits go down. Ask firms, factories in developing countries are resistant because they believe that profits go down, and that's been one paper at least has shown that. So does that answer your question?
This is Tristan Reed. I have a question. So just, I found the result that I guess imports from low-income countries to high-income countries decline, which is kind of exactly what I would expect, and I think is, probably relevant for instance, for the negotiations with Mexico between the U.S. This is about often protecting workers in the U.S. I think that your specification where you control for the machine learning selected variables is actually, and then you show that the effect goes away. I think that's actually a little too demanding in the sense that, those controls were selected exactly because they soak up all the variation of the trade agreement. And so it, of course, it would remove the effect of a provision that, wasn't included in that set. But I don't think that, I think it's maybe, that to me doesn't suggest that there's no effect of the labor provisions. I think just the raw effect of the labor provision on imports is still compelling. I don't know. I wouldn't like throw the result away as quickly, maybe.
Sure. So first of all, I agree with you. So you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the sense that I find that result particularly compelling. I would like maybe offline, you and I could have another conversation, because the results don't go away for labor provisions for flows in the opposite direction. So the story here would be not that those variables soak up all the variation and therefore take out the labor provisions. They only work that only happens in one direction. And it might be that those provisions are designed to increase, to perform the function that we think that labor provisions are having. Do you know what I mean? So we might want to think about that. If you want to help me think about that, I'd love to chat with you more. I mean, that'd be great, but.
I'd be happy to. Let's email afterwards.
That'd be great. Any other questions?
There's a question from Esau Kamata. Why don't you go ahead? Esau, are you going to ask your question? Yes, go ahead, Esau. You're muted. I can hear you typing.
You were unmuted. There you go.
Oh, can you hear me? Probably not.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Well, interesting paper, and thank you very much for your presentation. I actually have recent some paper still working together with my co-author, Naoto Jinji. He should be here too. We actually use the old version of the World Bank database about labor provisions in the PTAs. And our finding actually somehow suggests there should be the endogeneity on labor provisions, saying that the probably country may actually have some expectation, extended expectation of impact of the labor provision on trade flow, and they selectively decide whether they should agree with the labor provision or not when they actually negotiate or sign the PTA with a particular partners. And Raymond, does your paper have any sort of thoughts or implication, or do you have any rough thought about the potential endogeneity between trade flow and labor provisions?
So are you using the IV?
Well, yeah, we actually sort of use the IVs. Our IV is the whether a particular country have signed the labor provision inclusive PTAs before, or how many.
Yeah.
Labor provision.
I think that's a great idea. So yeah, and I really appreciate that suggestion. So you're right. I mean, as I said, I mentioned, I cited your paper, right? And then I agree that the endogeneity might be an issue. So I guess when I revise, I'm going to try and figure out if I can use some IV approach. Sure. That's a great idea. Yeah, thank you. Great.
One last question. Anybody?
Sorry, if I may jump in, this is Jacobo Timini from the Bank of Spain. We are also working on something similar, and I think what is very interesting, we find something in line with what I think it's in line with your results, is that basically looking at trade agreement with labor provisions, but there is really something going on between South export to the North, or let's say developing and emerging economies export to advanced economies. What we find is that really what matters is the legal enforceability. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on that, or thank you very much.
Yeah, so we only get negative significant effects for the south to north trade in the enforceability area, right? So I think there's two issues there. One is really defining the labor provisions in a way that captures enforceability accurately, and I'm not 100% sure that the handbook provisions are designed to do that. So, right, another classification might be relevant. But secondly, as I said, I mean, we only get those negative effects, but they do go away. I mean, Tristan's point notwithstanding, when you control for these other provisions, right, that sort of enforceability, the enforceability provisions that are in the HDTA, they were significant with the south to north trade, but then, you know, the results kind of evaporate after we include these other things. So you're right. I think it's a totally promising area, and I want to pursue that more, but that's what we found in this paper.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I dropped out when you were answering my question, but whatever you said is fascinating and interesting, and I hope we have a chance to talk more. We should move on now to the last paper today, which is on the effectiveness of environmental provisions in regional trade agreements by Ryan Abman, Clark Lundberg, and Michele. Clark of San Diego State University will present it. So Clark, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of our recent work. This is still preliminary and ongoing, so we certainly welcome any and all comments people have, suggestions, etc. So again, this is work looking at the effectiveness of environmental provisions in regional trade agreements. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, this is a timely topic, perhaps best evidenced by ongoing sort of conflict in EU-Mercosur negotiations. France in particular has been particularly critical of the potential for Amazonian deforestation arising from trade agreement. So this idea of how trade impacts the environment is not a new question. It's one that's attracted considerable interest from economists over the years on a broad variety of different outcome topics, including natural resources, deforestation in particular, as well as pollution. one of the challenges or issues with a lot of the empirical literature considering this, this relationship between trade and the environment is the use of trade openness as a trade measure. The challenge here is that any unobservable or omitted trends in issues like governance, technology, et cetera, might threaten the identification of the actual relationship. So in response to this, a newer strand of the literature has been using regional trade agreements specifically to investigate this, this relationship. So we think that this is an important and relevant development in the literature because RTAs are a very important trade policy tool, arguably one of the most widespread and important trade liberalization tools. And the discrete policy change nature, the sort of shock, policy shock represented by regional trade agreements provides opportunities for improved identification and even recovering some causal estimates from empirical studies. In particular, there's been some literature looking at the effects of RTAs on deforestation. Our recent work appearing in the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists in 2020. Also, there's another work looking at this same phenomenon in a historical context on Austro-Hungarian customs union and deforestation, as well as earlier work looking at regional trade agreements and emissions. So one issue here is that these trade agreements have been increasingly including provisions aimed at mitigating environmental impacts. And as we heard earlier today, there's sort of a policy discussion around this about whether or not these are actually designed to mitigate environmental damages or whether they might be a form of protectionism in disguise. So the scope of our here looks at whether environmental provisions aimed directly at forest conservation is mitigating deforestation arising from trade liberalization. And we have arguably four main contributions that we're making with this work. The first is that we're providing causal evidence on the effectiveness of these types of provisions in regional trade agreements. Specifically, we find that RTAs that include provisions aimed at forest or biodiversity conservation reduce forest loss by 50% relative to agreements that don't include these types of provisions. So this is approximately a 7 to 9% increase in forest loss with the inclusion of these provisions versus a 14 to 20% increase in forest loss for agreements that don't include these provisions. And I hope this next contribution will be broadly of interest to the audience here. We're providing a framework to identify causal impacts of trade agreement content. I think this is particularly relevant given the availability of the new deep trade database and a lot of the studies we've seen in the seminar series so far. And then finally, we have a methodological contribution as well, where we develop a modification or extension of the cluster robust covariance matrix that allows for sparse cross-cluster correlation. This is in response to an artifact of our identification strategy. We're focusing on deforestation as a measurable environmental outcome. We think this is incredibly important, first and foremost, because deforestation is one of the most critical environmental challenges that our world is facing today, both in its threat to biodiversity, but also as a loss of carbon sequestration and associated carbon emissions. But it also has some technical advantages as well. Deforestation is spatially explicit and geographically attributable. So this is in contrast to, say, emissions, where the emissions actually can move over time. It's also non-administrative data. We're actually using remote sensing satellite-derived measures of forest loss, which we believe can have some advantages, especially in the context of these types of environmental commitments, where there may be reporting incentive misalignments for governments that are engaging or seeing this type of deforestation activity. As I mentioned, we're using satellite-derived annual forest loss, and this is at a very, very, very fine resolution, spatial resolution. 30 square meters is the degree of resolution that we're working with. And because I expect most of the audience here will not be familiar with this type of data, I have a little example here to kind of illustrate exactly the type of deforestation we're able to detect with this data set using area in Western Kenya. So this plot of sub-Saharan Africa here shows you the tree cover density across the region. The color gradient in green represents the actual density of tree cover. And we're going to focus on a very small region over here, as I mentioned, in Western Kenya near Kisumu. And zoom in here. And again, the green color gradient denotes the tree canopy density. The red pixels are measured forest loss over our sample window, which is between 2001 and 2014. And we're going to zoom in even further in this region here, and I'm going to show you some Google Earth aerial photography comparing across time the actual land cover that we're seeing here. So we're focusing on this particular box here, and I'll flag for your attention that we see forest loss over on the left with that red cluster of pixels there, and then near the bottom. And so when we zoom in and look at the actual aerial photography, we can see that the deforestation that we're actually able to detect here is in my view, quite incredible. We're actually seeing parcel level clearing on the left in 2001 relative to the right, where we've seen land managers clear and put in agricultural crop fields. So this is a great and phenomenal data set that really allows analysis at any spatial resolution. Here in this study, we're working with country and agreement level analysis, but that's in some sense arbitrary. With this data, we can look at really any type of spatial resolution. We're identifying provisions germane to deforestation using the new Deep Trade database, specifically the environmental laws chapter. And we're focusing on two particular provisions that we believe are relevant for forest loss. The first is whether or not the agreement requires measures to prevent deforestation. And the second is whether or not there are provisions for protecting biodiversity. And to give you a little bit of a sense of what the evolution of these provisions look like, on the top left panel, we have the evolution of any trade agreements that include any type of environmental provisions at all. On the top right panel, we have the inclusion of provisions related to deforestation explicitly. Bottom left is biodiversity. And on the bottom right, we have the set of provisions, the set of agreements that include the provisions that we're considering. So either of those types of provisions. And the question we have is whether or not these provisions are actually effective. However, answering that question presents some challenges. The foremost challenge here is that agreement content is not exogenous. This is an issue that has come up repeatedly throughout the seminar series, questions and issues related to the endogeneity of these provision inclusions. Additionally, there's some challenges that in that existing approaches used in the trade literature are not well equipped or designed really to address this particular type of endogeneity. So some of the sort of canonical techniques aren't designed to address this particular type of content endogeneity. Above that, the outcome that we're looking at, forest loss, is also not attributable to a bilateral country pair in the same way that trade flows are. So we have additional sort of issues arising from the scope of our study. So we're going to identify and answer this question using two relatively unrelated identification strategies. The first is a multiple event study at the country level, where we're identifying the effects using the plausibly exogenous treatment timing of entry into force trade agreements. This identifies dynamics around the entry into force, but it does not directly address the endogeneity of provisions. In response to this, there's a follow-up to this. We also look at a matched triple difference analysis at the trade agreement level that is designed explicitly to account for the endogeneity of these provisions that we're looking at. And the approach that we take yields average treatment effect on the treated estimates, which are a causal parameter. And importantly, the agreement level analysis accounts for sort of shifting a reallocation of deforestation activity between signatories because we're aggregating up activity across all parties. As I mentioned, the multiple event study framework estimates the dynamics of entry into force, and we allow for multiple overlapping treatments, which contrasts with sort of the standard event studies that you might see in a difference in difference study. Here we have multiple treatments per individual. We're including dummies for leads and lags around entry into force with country and year fixed effects. And I want to mention very briefly that this event study framework pools the time periods outside of the main event window. So we have what we call long run leads and lags. And I'm going to show you a plot here where I would flag for your attention that the interpretation of our 4-year leads and lags is not the same as the others because it's pooled years outside of our window. We omit the year before entry into force. And with the inclusion of country fixed effects, this yields the reference group for this model to be the year before entry into force at the country level. So here we've got just a sort of simple plot with 95% confidence intervals of the dynamic effects for our 2 different RTA treatments. The black line shows the dynamics around entry into force of agreements without the environmental provisions we're considering. The red line is the same, but for RTAs that do include these provisions. And so I'll flag for your attention that agreements that do not have these provisions, we see a significant rise in forest loss starting the year of implementation and for several years following. The provisions that do include environmental provisions aimed at deforestation, we see effectively a flat dynamic response once the trade agreement goes into force. So we find this relatively compelling evidence that these provisions seem to be doing something. As I mentioned, though, we still have some residual concerns about the endogeneity here, and that we don't want to push too hard on a causal interpretation of this result, given our concerns about endogeneity, which is why we proceed with the next exercise, which is a matched triple difference framework. So the idea here is that we want to match treated units, which are agreements that include these environmental provisions, to similar agreements that don't include the provisions, with the goal being to construct an appropriate counterfactual that allows for causal identification of the provision inclusions. So we're matching based on a sort of standard propensity score approach using the Logit model to estimate the probability of provision inclusion at the agreement level. And then we're going to create 2 matched samples based on propensity score similarities. So we have 38 treated units in our sample window. The sample window is constrained by our deforestation data. So we're looking at agreements that go into force between 2001 and 2014. 38 of those include environmental provisions. So again, we're going to match those agreements to agreements that don't include those provisions by finding the closest propensity score. And we're creating 2 samples, one in which we match without replacement, which yields 38 control units, 38 control RTAs. And then we're also matching with replacement, whereby we allow a control unit to match to multiple treated units, yielding only 17 control agreements. And the idea here is that there's a bias variance trade-off. So the larger the control sample, sort of more statistical power we have to identify effects. However, with the smaller, more precisely matched sample, we have more similar control units that we're matching to. So with this matched sample, we then create an agreement level panel. And to do so, we aggregate the outcomes to the agreement level over all of the signatory countries by year. And I think an important point here is to recognize that this aggregation yields net outcomes. So if we have, again, as I mentioned, kind of shifting activity, so if forest loss goes down in one party, but is what we might refer to as offshored to another signatory country, we would effectively see a 0 change. So we're measuring net outcomes, which we really believe is the most important way to be thinking about this from a global environmental externality perspective. The other point I'd mention here is that this type of aggregation scheme is especially appropriate in settings where the outcomes are at the country level and not bilateral flow. So deforestation in particular, but looking at industry outcomes, say labor market outcomes, manufacturing outcomes, et cetera, where we're looking at the actual activity in country rather than trade flows themselves. And here we have the actual estimating equation here. It's a pretty simple triple difference model where we've got dummy variables for post entry into force of trade agreements, as well as an interaction with trade agreements that include the two types of forest-related provisions we're looking at. And then we have agreement and time fixed effects. We want to cluster standard errors at the agreement level, but because countries enter into multiple agreements in our sample, what this does is it induces some cross-cluster correlation arising from this overlapping agreement membership, which violates the assumptions of a standard cluster robust covariance matrix. So in response to this, we develop an extension to clustered errors that permit sparse cross-cluster correlation. So I won't show you the details here unless people have questions during the Q&A session. But I'll just mention that what we're doing is we're leveraging structural information we have about the agreement membership content to basically create a generalization of these cluster robust errors that weights by the degree of overlap in agreement membership. And so here's our main findings. And we really think this is the kind of the main point of the paper. This is our triple difference model estimation. We have as the outcome variable the log of forest loss aggregated to the agreement level. And we see, consistent with some of the recent developments in the RTA and deforestation literature, we see a significant increase in forest loss following the entry into force of trade agreements, with between a 14 and 20% increase following entry into force. Models 1 and 2 are our match sample analysis. Model 1 includes matching without replacement, so our larger sample size. Model 2 includes the sample where we've matched with replacement, yielding a smaller sample size. Now, what's particularly interesting and sort of the focus of this paper are our findings on the inclusion of these provisions. Now, I'll flag for your attention the difference in notation here between our asterisks and our daggers. We have a very specific hypothesis that we're testing with the inclusion of these provisions, and that's whether or not these provisions reduce forest loss. So the dagger indicates significance from a one-sided hypothesis test. And we do find significant evidence that the inclusion of these provisions is reducing forest loss relative to provisions that don't include them. And again, as I sort of previewed for you at the beginning of this talk, the reduction is roughly equivalent to a 50% decline in forest loss relative to the agreements that don't include these provisions. And then finally here to kind of highlight really the degree of the endogeneity problem, we present a full pooled triple difference model here where we've included all agreements regardless of whether or not they're similar, et cetera. And we see the significance disappear. We see the sign flip, and the magnitude of the increase for agreements that don't include the provisions also basically disappear. So I think this is really sort of, I hope, compelling evidence that this is a series, the endogeneity of trade agreement content really is a quite significant technical hurdle to overcome. And finally, we want to explore kind of the mechanisms about how or why this apparent mitigation might arise. And to do so,
Clark,
yes.
You have actually just 1 or 2 minutes left, please.
Okay, great. This is about my last slide here. We consider the effects of these provisions on two really strongly forest displacing activities: forest harvesting, forest product production, as well as agricultural production. And so we find some evidence that there is a reduction in production of forest-derived products following entry into force of provisions that include these. We don't find any action on agricultural production. So to just very briefly show you this, here we have minimally processed forest products like logs and boards and such. This is processed forest products like pulp, paper, etc. And we see a significant reduction here in one of our match samples. We also consider trade in these two different types of product categories. And notably, we see a reduction in total trade following the entry into force of these types of trade agreements that include the provisions, both in forest products as well as agricultural products. So we think that this is suggestive of kind of how and why we might see this effect on forest loss, where it does seem to be mitigating gains from trade in sectors that threaten forestry and biodiversity. So some of the next steps that we want to look at, we want to engage in a little bit more robustness checks with our propensity score estimation steps. So we've got plans to implement a Bayesian model selection approach for that. And we also want to look at heterogeneous effects for tropical countries, but also developing countries to sort of try and identify where exactly the bulk of this action is arising. And we also want to apply a framework to additional outcomes, especially environmental outcomes, where we have some work in progress looking at the effects of provisions aimed at emissions in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's
Thank you.
all for now.
We have about
Please reach
5
out to
minutes
any and
now.
all of us with any questions or comments.
Yeah, thanks, Clark. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Clark, if I can ask you one thing to start things off, can you give us examples of countries which are, because when I was looking at the set, the number of countries with these agreements with these provisions, I don't know if I read the graph right, it seemed relatively few, seemed like 5 or 7. So can we, can you think of countries, I was thinking of Indonesia or Brazil, and I can't imagine agreements which have had a significant influence on how they, their domestic management of forests, but that would help motivate this exercise.
Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned earlier EU-Mercosur negotiations. I mean, Brazil is sort of the central concern. Brazil, but also, to a lesser extent, other South American countries. But this is the idea behind the environmental oppositions to the trade agreement. You may be referring to our propensity score estimation model. So it's not that we don't have very many countries that are party to agreements that include these provisions. The issue was we have a dimensionality sort of challenge in that LOGIT model where we sort of can't include every single possible country in our entire sample. And so when we're sort of trying to predict the probability of these provision inclusions, we have a very limited set of countries that we have identified ex post as being party to a lot of these types of agreements. So that's the approach is that we're taking there. Is, for example, Peru has been a party to a lot of trade agreements in which these types of provisions show up, largely from a selection bias type of result there.
Okay. Any other questions?
This is Tristan again. I have maybe a comment. I guess I liked how you posed the question at the beginning. Is this about protecting the environment or protectionism? And it seems that there are kind of both things going on. That there's actually less exports because of this work. And I was wondering if you could just sort of take that to the next step and say, okay, what's the value, of losing these exports, and then what would the valuation of the environment, have to be for Kenya to want to do this?
We certainly that's a sort of I wanted to have something to show today, but I didn't have time to table it up. But we want to look at sort of an aggregate just GDP effect and measure sort of the impact to see if there's sort of a detectable impact on GDP with these provisions. The latter comment is a bit challenging because of the heterogeneity and the challenge of sort of ecosystem valuation when you have a global study. So protected forest or forest conservation in Central Africa may be very, very different than, say, protected forest in I don't know, the Gran Chaco in South America or something like that. And especially when we start wading into the biodiversity issue, like how do you value different types of biodiversity? So I think that I agree, right? Because our results suggest that there's trade-offs happening here. We would like to speak a little bit to the trade-offs, but I think at the end of the day, given the global scope of our study, it's going to be really hard to do anything other than kind of a back of the envelope calculation.
Yeah, no, that's great. You don't have to take a stand on the valuations. I guess it's just like, you know, where did they fall? And, you know, we forget that Germany got to, you know, completely destroy the Black Forest in the 19th century, you know, and enjoyed economic growth.
Right.
Let's see. Anyway, thank you.
Any last questions? Okay, then we'll have the distinction of finishing virtually on time. I want to, since it's the last seminar of this series, I want to thank and congratulate Anna, Nadia, and Michele for this remarkable effort. What began as a mechanical database and then a handbook has really grown into a rich and impressive body of work with tremendous potential. Well done, congratulations. If I can say one thing that struck me today, and it'd be great if, as we continue the empirical work with this very rich data set, we also think hard about mechanisms. Ingo would like you all to know that the Black Forest exists.
Thank you.
So we can, I was going to say, so we can tell the forest from the trees, because there are lots of data in this database. And so a conceptual framework which helps us to understand the mechanisms, which also help us to sift through these many different provisions, these many different measures, and also help to inform, you know, structurally, analytically, the kind of specifications that, so that we come away from this not just with whether these things matter for trade or environment or labor standards, but why and how. And in some cases, it'll be nice to maybe just complement it with examples or stories or case studies for specific countries and their experience in specific agreements. But overall, this is a fantastic body of work. And thank you very much, Anna, Nadia, Michele, everybody else. Alvaro, I don't know if he's there. He played a really important role in all this. But thank you and good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks to all presenters and participants. This was a great series of webinars.
Thank you very much, the organizers. You guys did a great job.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for participating. Bye. Thanks, Aaditya.
Bye.
Michele, bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.